Today we are talking about, as you can see on the slide, what's the big deal about breakfast? We've all heard that breakfast is the most important meal of the day. Is that true? And if so, why? And what is so important about it? So let's look at the evidence. We know that breakfast can vary. This is one example. I don't know if anyone's ever been to England. I have not. But this is what I'm told is maybe a typical English breakfast out in a restaurant. These are called English bangers. They are a type of sausage. It looks like a pretty hearty meal, let's just say. On the other hand, we have breakfast that looks a little like this. And this, you might say, is a little bit more like a typical, for some, American breakfast. So there's a big range of what people are doing. A lot of people are pretty familiar with studies that have looked at learning in school and whether or not kids have breakfast. This was a nice little article published a few years back, but it was a literature review that covered studies from 1950 all the way through 2013. And so I thought it was interesting to look at that time span. But pretty consistently, we do see that when we look at children, they do better in learning, in school behavior. They tend to get better grades if they are breakfast eaters. So this is one of the things people are pretty familiar with. Skipping breakfast has also been linked to heart disease. This was a huge study that you see on your screen here. Well, more than 4,000 people. It was done in Madrid, Spain. And you can see the ages surveyed were ages 40 to 54. And they divided people into the three categories of breakfast eaters: high energy, which made up at least 20% of their daily calories; low energy breakfast, which was anything less than that, starting at 5%, and then those who skipped breakfast, which was basically, they might have had a bite here or there, but they were getting a very small amount of calories in anything they ever did eat for breakfast. These were how the categories broke down in the population. And I would say, certainly right now, if we looked at these categories in the United States, I think we would see quite different numbers. 70% of people in Spain, or in this study in Spain, were shown to be getting at least some breakfast, but was considered a low energy breakfast. And I think we would, here in the United States, just this is my gut sense, that we would probably have more breakfast skippers. And so I'm not sure. I haven't looked at the data on that. But what they found was that breakfast skippers and those who had low energy breakfast were at increased risk of atherosclerosis. So, and you may be familiar with atherosclerosis, hardening of the arteries. It's where you have plaque building up on the inside of arteries. Not good for cardiovascular disease, not good for lifespan. Breakfast skippers in this study were also more likely to consume more total calories, more protein, and especially protein from animal sources, and more dietary cholesterol, which would go right along with consuming more protein from animal sources. They also tended to have the lowest fiber and total carbohydrate intakes. They tended to have more alcohol, sweet drinks, and red meat in their diets. So this was the adjusted odds ratio for obesity by breakfast patterns. So you see on the bottom, high breakfast eaters, high energy breakfast eaters, low energy breakfast eaters, and those who skipped breakfast entirely. This was the odds ratio, in other words, more than 4-fold baseline risk of becoming obese if you skip breakfast. And you see it is pretty linear here with large breakfast, small breakfast, and no breakfast. And then when we look at metabolic syndrome, which we're going to define as having high blood pressure, high cholesterol, high waist to hip ratio, diabetes, or any one of those, and obesity, or any one or combination of those factors, this is, again, the way it looks with the breakfast skippers looking at even increased risk over what we saw on the last slide. So linear, but a steeper curve. Now, this is the adjusted odds ratio for atherosclerosis, and they divided it up into different kind of levels of concern of atherosclerosis, but all the same. When you look at who skips breakfast, you have increased risk of those plaques on the inside of the arteries. Now, the National Weight Control Registry is an interesting, it's actually a registry that is online. It's been going for a number of years now, and it is a kind of site where you can go to see who has lost weight at least 30 pounds and kept it off for at least a year. So when we look at behaviors among people who are eligible to be included in the National Weight Control Registry, it might give us a few indicators of what works for weight loss and weight loss maintenance. So in the Weight Control Registry, 80% are women, 20% men participate. This is the average woman, weighs 145 pounds now. The average man weighs 190 pounds now. And on average, combining all registry members, they've lost 66 pounds, have kept it off for more than 5 years. Now, you can see the weight range is very, very broad. You have to lose at least 30 pounds to be included in the weight control registry. And as I said before, you have to have kept that weight off for at least 1 year before you're eligible also to be included. And then from this registry, there's a lot of research that has been done. And some of the statistics from that National Weight Control Registry show that almost everybody report having made dietary changes. Similar number report increasing exercise. We know that both of these lifestyle changes can result in some significant improvements in our health and also in our weight. 62% watch less than 10 hours of television per week. 90% exercise, and they average an hour a day. And there have been a number of studies showing that if you want to control your weight, 1 hour a day of exercise is what you need to be doing. Now, it doesn't mean you have to go out running for an hour a day, but it means cumulative exercise over that day. 78% of the people in the registry report eating breakfast every day. So that would suggest to us that, again, more evidence of breakfast being associated with better weight management. So this is another specific study looking at that association between obesity and breakfast habits. Eating breakfast, and again, like what you saw earlier in the Spanish study, making it, in this case, the largest meal of the day, was shown to reduce obesity risk. And I want to point out here the second factor, reduced risk with a longer overnight fast. So what that means is shrinking the window of time that people can eat in a 24-hour period. So if they were fasting at least 18 hours, then they're only eating over a 6-hour time span in the day. And that has been seen to be helpful with obesity management as well. And that is, you might say, a form of intermittent fasting. But that's another talk for another time. So, little history lesson for today. In the late 1800s, the Kellogg's brothers developed cornflakes, and that was established around the same time as the advent of mass advertising and also refrigeration that made milk available to many, many Americans who didn't necessarily live on a farm or didn't have ready access. The Industrial Revolution standardized time at which people worked. So in other words, there were now many factories where people were working. There were stores that would open at fairly standard times, businesses. So what this meant was that Americans needed something that was kind of quick and easy, and off to work they went. World War II, with many more women being in the workforce, also meant that there was not someone who was at home um, able to prepare a hot breakfast that required a little bit more work and time. So all of this happening over this time span meant that something like cornflakes with milk became a pretty standard breakfast, or something similar for many people. And breakfast needed to be quick and easy. And we have certainly seen that trend continue or even pick up in the last 50 years. So reality is that cornflakes are a highly refined, highly processed carbohydrate. There's not a lot to recommend about them, nutritionally speaking. Most of our ready-to-eat breakfast cereals are high in these refined grains. They're also high in sugar. Now, you can find some that are not high in sugar, at least, and you can find a fair amount that are high in whole grains, but that is actually something you have to look for. If you choose carefully, they're there to be found. But breakfast, I want to point out, doesn't have to be cornflakes. It doesn't have to be cereal. It doesn't have to be milk. It doesn't have to be any kind of specific food. And if it's good for you to eat at dinner time at 6 p.m., it's also good for you to eat at 6 a.m., nutritionally speaking. So American breakfast, let's just take a look at what we often include in an American breakfast. There's juice. We're not going to say that's the best food component at breakfast, simply because juice is loaded in sugar and concentrated in calories. And certainly if you're trying to control your weight or your blood sugar, I advise that you eat your fruit, don't drink it. So juice is maybe one of those less desirable components. Sugar, I've mentioned, is a part of not only breakfast cereals, but you think toaster pastries, donuts, and pastries in general often are a component at breakfast. If you go to meetings, conferences, well, I guess we used to go to those things before COVID, but you will frequently see, if they start early morning, they will offer pastries and other sweet items. Even for most Americans, if they're going to eat yogurt, which is a high protein, most people would say healthy food, most of them are going to choose the pretty high sugar variety. So American breakfasts also are, as we've mentioned, fairly high in processed starches, refined starches. That means that they are carb sources, but without the fiber. And the grain, the bran of the outside of the grains has been stripped away. And so you're left with this refined carbohydrate that is very rapidly digested and absorbed, and can wreak havoc on blood sugar levels. Oh, and of course there's sugar. And many American diets, if they include a lot of the bacon and sausage, they are going to be high in saturated fat. That saturated fat comes mostly from animals, and some exceptions are coconut and palm oil, which have some different properties from animal fats, but they're still saturated. And did we mention sugar? A big part of the American breakfast. So what makes a good breakfast? Some source of protein, and here you see examples of protein: meat, fish, poultry, eggs, dairy foods, beans, soy foods. I want to mention that you don't have to eat all these foods. Many people do not tolerate several of the dairy foods well, but these give us options. There are lots of sources of protein. And some kind of protein, whichever one you choose, is a good thing to include at breakfast. And I would say at every meal. Some source of starch, when we consider that breakfast means breaking our overnight fast, for many people, I'm going to say probably most people, when you get up in the morning, your blood sugar is about the lowest that it's going to be in a 24-hour period. So it actually does make good sense to get some carbohydrate into you at that time. There's evidence that our insulin is less sensitive late in the day as we're heading toward bedtime. So it is more sensitive when we get up in the morning. And so that suggests that we are likely to be in need of carbohydrate and be able to handle it well early in the day versus late in the day. Doesn't mean you can't eat carbohydrate late in the day, I want to point out, but that maybe there is something to it when people talk about don't eat too much late in the day and don't eat too late. So we're at the other end of the day with breakfast, and it sounds like a great idea to get some source of starch. Remember that the brain, to function optimally, wants a constant supply of glucose. So we get that from these starchy foods. These are just some examples. Of course, I don't have listed up there, but fruit is also a source of starch, and sugar for that matter. We don't worry about fruit sugar because normally if you're eating a normal portion of fruit, you're not overdoing the sugar. It's not highly concentrated as in juice. And it is, let's say, supported by a good amount of fiber that comes along with fruit. So local and seasonal is best. Fruit makes a great part of a good breakfast. And if you are eating fruit seasonally, or for that matter, vegetables seasonally, it kind of ensures that you're getting some variety in your diet. And, you know, right now it's strawberry season, and strawberries are like most fruit, going to be best when you are eating what's local. It hasn't been that long since it's been picked. It's picked ripe or very close to ripe. And so the quality is going to be the best, and nutritional quality as well. So other add-ons you can include at breakfast: nuts, seeds. I don't think it's a problem to add a little bit of jam to some good chewy whole grain bread or toast. But obviously you want to be careful about how much, not overdoing the sweet component of the meal. Dried fruit in wintertime is a good option when you don't necessarily have access to berries or fresh local berries, certainly. And then coffee and tea tend to be a part of a traditional American breakfast, and are included in many cultures around the world at breakfast. As it says here, dose makes the poison. You know, a lot of researchers over a lot of years have been trying to demonize coffee, and they just haven't been particularly successful. We keep finding out that there are ingredients and substances in both coffee and tea that actually seem to be quite good for us. However, coffee and tea, both with their caffeine contents, can have pharmacological effects if you consume a lot of those beverages, because then you're getting a lot of caffeine, and caffeine is a drug. So a cup of coffee, cup or two of coffee, that sounds pretty moderate. So some people tell me I do fine if I just don't eat breakfast. And if I eat breakfast, I'm hungry sooner than I would otherwise be. I tell them, keep a record of what you eat, how much, and what time for the next 1 to 2 weeks. Then you're going to write down only one other thing. When do you first notice feeling hungry during the day? And what you're looking for is a trend. Is there a kind of breakfast that tends to sustain you better through the morning? And that's what is going to work with you instead of against you. And most people are going to find that if they have a higher protein component in the morning, or if they're not getting a lot of the refined carbs and sugar, they do way better in terms of managing their appetite. Now, of course, there's also quantity versus quality. I guarantee if you were to eat this, you're not going to be hungry by lunchtime, or you can certainly make it through the morning. But you don't want to have to make up in quantity for what would otherwise be a high quality breakfast that can achieve the same degree of appetite management. And so, as you see here, you can get both good nutrition and satisfaction. But usually that's going to mean we need to think about what it is we're going to make for breakfast and what we're going to have, and do a little bit of that planning. So we've got a lot of this ultra processed food that has snuck into our breakfast. So how do we define that? Multi-ingredient industrial formulations, and they're really in all these packaged kinds of foods, and they tend to be very sweet. And guess what? 61% of calories in our packaged food and beverage purchases come from these kinds of foods. So we Americans are not doing ourselves a favor by eating a lot of this highly refined carbohydrate, is basically what it is. Fairly consistent support for the association of ultra-processed food intake with obesity and related cardiometabolic outcomes. In other words, diabetes and heart disease. So it would be great if we would start with breakfast and get these foods at least greatly reduced, if not eliminated, from our meals. So highly processed foods have little or no fiber. And even those, this is an important point, even those that list fiber on the ingredient label are sometimes so mechanically altered that they end up being like, think about how cornflakes are made. There's fiber in corn, no doubt. But when you make cornflakes, you make kind of a mash, you dehydrate it, you pulverize it into this powder, and then you reconstitute it and shape it into little flakes that are then toasted and dried. So essentially, in the factory, some of your digestion's already been done. And that means when you eat these carbs, your body rapidly breaks them down, and they are pretty quickly just drawn into the bloodstream, spike insulin levels, and these high blood sugars increase risk for both diabetes and triglycerides that are elevated. So breakfast cereal, a way to make it work for you. Add nuts and seeds. It's a good source, small source of protein, good source of high quality fat. Add some fruit, especially if you're adding something like berries, you're going to be adding fiber with that fruit. A little bit of fiber from nuts and seeds, by the way, as well. Make sure there is some protein. So if you like breakfast cereal in the morning, these are sources of protein for you. All of the other non-dairy milks provide little or no protein, 0 to 1 gram of protein per cup, whereas everything you see here is going to be 7 or 8 grams of protein per cup. Meaningful difference. If you're choosing a breakfast cereal, you want to get at least 5 grams of fiber per serving, and if you can do a little more, that's probably fine too. Just know that every teaspoon of sugar is equal to 4 grams that you see on the label. Not a heaping teaspoon, but a level teaspoon is 4 grams. This is an example of Raisin Bran Crunch. 46 grams of total carbs, that would be 3 carbohydrate exchanges if you're diabetic, more than I'm going to recommend you have at one meal, probably. 13 of these grams are added sugar. So that means this is a breakfast cereal with more than 4 teaspoons of sugar. If you were to have something like shredded wheat, no sugar added, 0 sugar, whole grain, but you're going to say, but it doesn't taste sweet. I don't like it. It's dull. It's like cardboard. But even if you added 2 teaspoons of sugar, that's probably more than a lot of people would put on an unsweetened cereal. You're still coming in at less than half what you'd get in eating this pre-sweetened cereal. So what I recommend, determine which breakfast works best for you, and make sure you include some protein, starch with fiber. Get some fruit with it is ideal. Maybe optional, but it's ideal. Use mostly whole real foods and limit those highly processed, highly refined carb foods. And I would say, does it pass what I call the guest test? That is, would you serve this to a guest in your home and call it a meal? So, questions and answers. We are just about out of time, and I think our participants do not have chat capabilities, unfortunately. So we'll end it there. Thank you.